So thanks again for coming. Come to the rest of them, check our website for that, and please welcome Skylar Borgstrom.
So, first of all, I agree with John. Thank you for coming out on a snowy evening. I'm really excited to talk about Sara's work because I always think it's a good time to talk about other artists' work, especially artists in Western New York and Buffalo specifically. So, as John mentioned, when he asked me to speak and choose an artist I'd like to talk about, I asked him if I could have a few days to think about it. And Buffalo is home to a huge number of really outstanding artists in a number of fields. So it was actually a really tough choice to come up with just one artist to talk about. I thought immediately of some artists that are here tonight, including Kate Gowdy and Mark Snyder. I also thought of artists like Amanda Bessel, Kurt Triebe, Gary Shabanowitz, Patrick Ferran, Kyle Butler, and the list literally goes on and on and on. There's absolutely no shortage of amazing artists in Buffalo. So all of the people that I mentioned make really incredible work, and in the end I chose Sara because, in my opinion, she's a painter's painter. Her working style is somewhat similar to my own, and honestly, as a painter and sculptor myself, I'm very picky about the painters that I like. I'm completely enamored with Sara's color palette, her brush stroke, and that's before we even get to talking about the content of her work. Her paintings, for me at least, have this incredibly haunting, bordering on disturbing quality. And if you know or have met her personally, you'll know that she's like a very friendly, welcoming, warm person. And so to see these somewhat disturbing images come out in her work was interesting to me. It's because of that beauty, the combination of beauty and the disturbing, that I think makes Sara's work so enormously successful. So I wanted to start with some context in terms of other artists that I like and that I see affinities between in terms of Sara's work. I'm sure many of you know this is the work of artist Jenny Saville. Her work has always struck me as incredibly visceral and overwhelming. I was in San Francisco's Museum of Modern Art a few years ago, and there's an absolutely enormous painting that they have of hers. It's probably at least 14 feet tall. And I took the opportunity to, have a seat in front of it and spend some time with it, even though it's borders on grotesque. But it's fleshy, and it's also a really, really wonderful painting. So another artist is Alex, and I'm going to butcher his last name, Kanevsk. He's a Russian-born painter who works in Philadelphia. I see a similarity between his work and Sara's in that intentionally blurred style and sort of questioning time and space, particularly in the image on the left-hand side. And then finally, as a final comparison, Francis Bacon. His work to me is beautiful, and it's horrifyingly beautiful. And it doesn't seem to matter which image of his that you look at. There's generally a very, very dark side to it. So I'm sure if you're a fan of his work, there's probably not much more I could say about that you don't already know. So before we dive right in, I wanted to give you a little bit of a background on Sara if you don't know her. In addition to being an artist, she's also an educator. Sara has a Master of Science degree in multidisciplinary studies, whatever that means. For her, it means fine arts, English, and education. a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting, and a Bachelor of Arts in Art History. So because of that, it should be no surprise that Sara's work is not only visually stunning, but also heavily layered with content. I want to begin with my interpretations of Sara's work, and I do call them interpretations because even though Sara and I have talked about her work many times, I think still the artist is oftentimes the only one who can communicate to you exactly what's behind their work. But I wanted to start out talking about the exhibition that John mentioned, which was her exhibition at the Castellani as part of their Topspin exhibition series, which unfortunately they're not doing anymore. It was the first time I had a chance to see Sara's work in person. I had seen some of her paintings elsewhere in other places, but it was the first time I was actually able to stand in front of it. And in terms of painting, I think we've gotten used to this idea of, you know, looking everything up online, looking it up on the screen, but it really is a much different experience when you're standing in front of the painting itself. So I was absolutely blown away with her work, not only by the work itself, but also by Sara's talk about the work and the deeply conceptual nature of her work. So I can only assume that Sara has an affinity for Francis Bacon because of the opening statement that she made at the show, which is a quote by Francis Bacon which says, "If you can talk about it, why paint it?" And honestly, I couldn't agree more, which is funny because I'm here talking about painting, obviously. But when I'm looking at Sara's paintings, it's very difficult for me to try to describe the emotions that her work evokes in me. And it really does make me realize how right Francis Bacon was. This large-scale work, and by large, this is a, I believe, 7-panel piece, over 100 inches wide. The title is "Hold to the Now, the Here, through which all future plunges to the past." So, and as you'll see as we go along, Sara's a real fan of tongue twister titles. So in this image in particular, we see a young girl playing in the waves. And I imagine that each time the waves touch her, we see a new version of her because she's repeated throughout the painting. It's as if we're looking at multiple realities at the same time. And for me, that's shored up by the scientific diagram that's at the top of the image. And also what I've likened to call transportation pods. The globe-like things that are hanging on the right side of the painting, which I imagine hooking people, you know, through their flesh and dragging them off to the next dimension. So again, this is another large multi-work panel. The title is "Limits of the Diaphane." So in this particular image, the blurred figures of the little girls dancing, again, questions the nature of time. In other words, are we seeing one girl multiple times? Are we seeing multiple girls in mid-stride, essentially? The painting application here is particularly beautiful, including the stained glass dome that's at the top of the image. It not only adds to the architectural nuance of this particular painting, but again, for me, references time, a globe, a sun, a clock. And beside that, the sun, there's this, what I interpret to be an ominous cloud, or a dirty ceiling, one of the two. So of all Sara's work in this exhibition, this is the one that I find most disturbing in a very sort of delicious way. I imagine many things going on in this painting. I think part of the reason for my affinity for Sara's paintings is they all do have a strong narrative quality. there's not so much information in them that you're presented with a complete story. You're presented with a part of a story which you then sort of get to play, you know, around with what is the actual meaning of. So in this particular image, there's a young girl in my mind sailing through time. You know, she's at once on a swing set, in another reality, she's in an abandoned building. The red trails behind the figure and on the floor I think of as blood or a physical tearing on the body. And finally, I ask if this is simply a ghost image of a child that has passed away and somehow become stuck in this interspace that we see here. So the title of this work in particular is Something is Beginning. So I'm going to flip over to another swing painting, and you'll notice that there's several of them in this exhibition. But this one isn't obviously nearly as dark as the first one, both in color palette and my impression of it. Again, another one of Sara's tongue twister titles. The title of this work is A Very Short Space of Time Through Very Short Times of Space. Again, Sara's using this idea of swinging as a representation for the accumulated repetitions with slight variations that our lives essentially are made up of. One thing I haven't been able to agree with myself upon is whether or not this number 3 that's in the background, just to the right of the figure, and I see that as also being a sail from a sailboat in the back right-hand corner. But I haven't been able to determine for myself whether I think that number 3 is a forensic crime scene number placard, or, you know, it's a number on a sailboat. Sara would have to be here in order to answer which one, if it's either of those or neither. So the title of this piece is Think You're Escaping and Run Into Yourself. Again, multiple figures, more swinging, more of the same figure, and really what I interpret through Sara's work as being sort of this tearing through time in her pieces. This one, I haven't come to a conclusion on. The title is Let My Country Die for Me. And in the bottom half of the panel, you'll see that there's an American flag that's sort of been balled up and combined with another piece of fabric. I haven't wrapped my mind around what the content of this painting might be, or sort of the frenetic painting style that we see on the upper section. So, and finally, one of my favorites from this exhibition, and oddly one that I don't know the title of. So this is a split image, and for me, it sort of contrasts the illusion of sort of America the free, that's wrapped up literally in this case in the American flag, and then a certain horror for me that's caused by the carousel horse's face expression. The palette of this work leads me not to a happy, joyous childhood memory, but rather something out of a horror film in which, you know, one of these wooden horses that's been abused for decades escapes and tramples everyone. Pleasant thoughts, right? Pleasant thoughts. So I'd like to just read you a brief statement that was part of Sara's catalog essay for this exhibition. Because as I said before, I feel it will give you a greater insight into why she made the work as opposed to simply my interpretations. So in that essay, Sara says, we swing, we ride the carousel, we let the waves lap over us, and over us, and over us, and over us, and over us. Our lives are accumulated repetitions with slight variations, except when they're not. When Paris or Belgium is bombed, when a passenger jet crashes, during any mass tragedy, we all tune in. In all possibility, our lives don't really change, except if we number in the survivors, first responders, or families of the victims. Without fail, I'm overwhelmed with the thought of children left behind during these tragedies. I consider them for their loss of a parent or parents, yes, but even more for how this early loss will affect their lifelong experiences. In these paintings, I attempt to explore the psyche of children who experience the trauma of loss. From personal experience and research, I found that the child that experiences an early violent loss experiencing a fracture of time and memory, they repeatedly cycle back to the moment of loss, even if they were not present at the moment of trauma. So for Sara, these paintings, like the vast majority of my work, explore the shifting nature of time, place, concept, actuality, and finally paint. All of these notions rely heavily on the stability of our own perception of them. What if the perception keeps fracturing? What if time doesn't just move forward, but rather it moves like the swing or the carousel or the waves? So that exhibition at the Castellani, as I mentioned before, was my first exposure to Sara's work in person. I also teach at the same college that Sara does. So I've had an opportunity to chat with her about her work, and it's interesting how the themes of her work in that Castellani show are also very much present in her older works as well. So, for example, this piece is from 2013, and I saw it in someone's home from a distance and immediately recognized it as one of Sara's work, predominantly because of the color palette, but also because of the brushwork and it having that haunting quality that a lot of her work seems to have. Its title is This Time Laid Bare Coming into Existence. So while previous to the work at the Castellani, it is most definitely Sara's. And I see direct correlations in terms of content, right? So in this particular image, we have two spaces. So the question I ask is, are these two unique spaces, or are they one place in different realities or different times? Again, another work from Sara's architectural series, yet with, with similar themes and concerns. This work is titled, It Stops with the Clank of Iron Rails. So again, we see multiple spaces. And the question for me in all of these works is, are they in different times or are they in different spaces? So finally, and I was talking to someone about this earlier this evening, Sara has done, I believe, 2 series of daily paintings. So these are very small works. They're 4 inches by 4 inches in size. And she does one a day, I think usually for the last couple of years in the month of December. So painters will often tell you that forcing yourself to make a grand change in scale, so in other words, going from making work that's over 100 inches wide down to something that's 4 inches by 4 inches, can lead to good things, both in the large paintings and the small. So what I find interesting about these images in particular is that there are themes present that appear in the larger paintings as well. I'm thinking particularly of time and the clock, the Polaroid as proof of reality, and in many of them, the overlaid diagrams that we see later in her works. So I could talk about Sara probably for much longer than you'd be willing to listen. And she asked me earlier if I wanted her to be here this evening. And she may not have come because, basically I would probably out her and ask her to answer questions. So I'm going to stop my presentation there and ask if you have questions, which I may or may not be able to answer. And say thank you. John?
Well, you're a painter,
Yep.
so
Yes.
what affinities, like, do you have particular affinities that you feel with Sarah's work and your work, or the way you approach painting, or imagery, or the materiality of painting?
I feel the strongest correlation between in mine and Sarah's work is an affinity for the material itself. So Mark asked me earlier today, like, oh, well, if Sarah's not going to be there, how can I ask her what her favorite paint color is? And I'm like, it's King's Blue by Williamsburg. Because those are the kind of conversations that she and I have. So when I was an undergraduate in college, I described painting, the act of painting with oil paint, as this like incredibly sensuous, buttery material that, sort of gets under your skin a bit, literally and figuratively. And I know from talking to Sarah that she's that painter as well. There are some similarities in our color palette, which probably leads me to maybe enjoy her work more than some other painters. I really like work that's like has a lot of color in it. I'm not drawn to works typically, that have more muted tones. But I really do, I try to embody in my own work the fact that you're going to stand in front of a painting and you're going to have an emotional reaction, positive, negative, somewhere in between. But that you're going to feel that I put and had feelings when I was making that painting. And I definitely feel that when I look at Sarah's work. Yeah? More? No?
What's her full name? What's her full name?
Sara Zak.
Zach.
Yep. Middle initial M. Yes. And then the reason I'm saying that is so that you could have a look at her website. If, I'm not getting paid for this, but if any of you do decide to buy her work, I would be happy to come to your home and admire it every now and again. Because I can't afford them, unfortunately. Kate?
Do you know what Sarah's working on right now?
Nothing. And I say that because Sarah's been having some shoulder problems, and so that's not particularly conducive to painting. Mark?
Yeah, when you talked to her, did you ever go to her studio itself?
No,
No?
I didn't.
Do you know, like,
Her studio's in her basement.
Right.
Yeah.
I have my own opinion, I have my own ideas on that, and I was just wondering what your thoughts would be on that also. From what I understand, it's also like a low ceiling,
Mm-hmm.
like your standard sort of basement kind of space. And
Yeah.
she
Makes these gigantic paintings.
Gigantic paintings, and
Yeah.
she has a segment. And it's almost like it's a torturous process to make her work. Do you think her environment is also, I mean, I think it impacts everybody when they're working in our spaces and such, but what would be your interpretation of her environment, her studio?
Well, I mean, I have the impression of Sarah being a relatively private person, which I feel is maybe why I didn't get an invitation to the studio. Sarah has this sort of quiet calmness about her. And yet, these to me anyway, these incredibly disturbing images come out. And I know in my own practice, regardless of its, if it's a curator or a friend or, anyone, I don't like other people in my studio. It makes me incredibly, hyperly uncomfortable. And I don't know if that's because, I'm like, I don't want people looking at my stuff, or, You know, like it's my space and I get to make my work in my space. And maybe it's a holdover from graduate school, you know, where there's people in your studio all the time telling you what to make and how to make it. But my studio is my space and I don't want anyone else in there. And I certainly don't want anyone seeing work before it's completed, before I've decided that it's completed, because I don't want your 2 cents about how you think I should change it. So maybe Sarah's the same. In terms of scale, I absolutely suspect that the reason that she's broken up some of those really large paintings into panels is the same problem that I have, is I need to be able to get them up the stairs and out the door. John?
Well, speaking as a curator who loves invading artist studios
Yes?
and telling you what to do when
Uh-huh.
you're half finished, I have been to Sarah's studio.
Yeah.
And, you know, she lives in East Aurora. This is more to Mark's question. So she lives in East Aurora. It's in the basement. It's low ceiling. She's got, what, 2 or 3 kids.
Yep. 2.
And it is a tight space. I wouldn't call it claustrophobic, but, you know, there's stuff everywhere, right? And, but knowing Sarah as I do, she has a certain intensity and a certain kind of focus, an ability to kind of like really be into what she's doing at the moment.
Yeah.
So I kind of feel like that basement studio isn't oppressive to her. It's just like, that's what I have.
Yeah, and that's what I'm gonna do.
Focus on this panel and paint the hell out of it.
Yeah.
And what was, you know, a funny aside, we were in the studio, and, you know, like, when you're in a studio visit, like, you're always like poking around, going, oh, what's that, what's that? It's like, people don't talk about everything that's before you, and I would like point to a little painting, and go, oh, that's a really nice painting, what's that? And she would go, oh, that's just a demonstration painting I did for one of my classes, like where she was mimicking another painter. And then I'd look at another painting and go, that's really nice. She'd go, oh, that's another demo painting. And she was kind of halfway embarrassed, but I think it's kind of, I do have like a minor interest in the demonstration painting that teaching artists do, because you have to do them fast and they're to a purpose, but they also kind of reveal your own skill in translating something in a painting form. And so, you know, not that I thought they were better than her regular paintings, but I thought
That's the best answer.
They were like another layer that revealed something about
Right.
her, how adept she was as a painter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, like if I go back and I look at these particular paintings, you know, these paintings are much tighter than the paintings that she's done most recently. And so knowing what I know of Sarah, I also know that you know, she paints tight, she draws tight, and in order to get that loose quality that we saw with the last exhibition would have been work for her, specifically.
These were the ones she was like offering up on Facebook, right?
Yeah, for like $50 or
And,
something.
like there were like 10 of those I wanted to buy, but they would like go like that.
Oh, for sure. Of course.
Always too late.
Well, she, her and I had talked about her doing another series just this December, but I don't think that materialized. I don't think she had time. Yes.
I first came across Sarah in the Paintings for Preservation, which she was greatly involved in, and I greatly enjoyed seeing what came out of that over several years, but that seems to have ended. Do you know, is she still involved with that?
I don't know, actually. Sorry. Were those were architectural paintings?
Yes, so
Yeah.
she would go out to threatened buildings, and she and other artists would paint their own versions of the buildings that were under.
Yeah. The last time that I talked to her about sort of what's coming up in her practice, she said that architectural paintings were probably not in the forecast. Yeah.
Did you guys talk much about the Castellani show? Because I remember when I went to see the show, I was blown away. I mean, it was not what I was expecting.
Right.
And known, and I also thought it was she's intense. She's very intense, and she's very, you know, focused, and, you know, you could see her working with like tiny brushes almost mentally, right? You
Yeah.
could see her these things were huge, and they were broad strokes, and, you know, major pushing and pulling of paint around the canvas.
Mhm.
I did not expect that.
Well, and Sarah's the type of painter as well that, you know, before she starts a new series of work, she's doing a lot of research. She's looking at other artists. She's like literally devouring the work of other artists as well as written works to what I think is to get herself into a headspace that's going to allow her to put into the painting what's going to be most effective. C'est là? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay warm.